People always talk about Cornwall's cliffs and beaches, the postcard places, the old pubs that lean into the wind, but nobody tells you about the silence beneath it all. The whole county is just hollowed out, really. Veins of black rock running under your feet like a second world. Most of those tunnels have been sealed off now, but every now and then somebody finds a way in and things happen. That's how it started for me, too. I wasn't a miner by any means, just one of those strange hobbyists who spend weekends exploring what's left of the past. I'd been to a dozen mines before, but there was something different about the one near Penhollock Moor. The entrance was hidden in a tangle of bracken and old stone, marked by a collapsed sign half swallowed by moss now. Locals called it Trevena Pit, though it hadn't been a working site since before the First World War. They said that it was used again briefly in the 80s, but that never felt right to me. Some places just don't wake up well when you disturb them, I guess, but a friend of mine, Ed, came along that day. We carried proper gear: helmets, lamps, gas detector, ropes. We knew the tunnels twisted pretty deeply and the lower parts flooded partway, but the top levels were meant to be safe. It was a still, overcast morning when we went down. The first hour passed uneventfully. The air was dry and stale, our lamps catching glittering veins in the walls where tin and quartz still clung. Then we reached the lower section that I hadn't explored before, a corridor that narrowed, dropping into the oldest part of the mine. The stone here was different too, damp, darker, almost porous. And the moment that I stepped in, my gas detector began ticking off slowly, and then there was a huge shriek. The reading spiked to 100%, and the oxygen dropped like a stone. I stopped breathing for a second, waiting for that dizzy feeling that meant that we needed to turn back, but it just never came. The air felt the same. Heavy, yes, but not deadly. I looked back at Ed. His face was pale in the lamplight. And then we heard something. It wasn't keys, not exactly. It was a faint sort of clinking sound, metal brushing against stone, maybe. It was like something was dragging a chain just out of sight. The sound drew closer, echoing in a weird way, as if it were coming from several directions at once. And with it came a feeling that is genuinely hard to describe properly. Not cold, but like the space around us just had weight suddenly, pressing us into the rock. We both froze. The sound passed between us, the air moving as if something unseen had brushed by us, and I could smell something faintly, sweet and wrong. It was the scent of like burning oil, or maybe like old corroded metal or something. Then the gas detector stopped. The readings returned to normal. Neither of us spoke for nearly a minute, and eventually we decided to keep going. The exit at the far end was closer than turning back, and it felt safer to keep moving. The silence swallowed every step that we took, and about 20 minutes later, it happened again. The alarm wailed, oxygen dropped, and the sound, slower this time, began behind us, chain against stone, dragging and scraping, and this time, though, we also heard what sounded like breathing. I could almost feel it at the back of my neck, like static. We pressed ourselves against the wall, and once again the noise moved between us, carrying that invisible weight with it, that pressure that sort of made your chest ache. When it passed, I swore that I heard it stop further ahead as well, near the flooded chamber, and then, and I will never forget this as long as I live, there was one single huge splash, like something literally just jumped into the water. The alarm suddenly went silent, and we didn't wait. We half ran the rest of the way out of there, the light from the entrance looking impossibly small until we burst into the open air, gasping and just clinging at our chests. We sat there for a long time, the detector lying between us, screen blank as if it hadn't recorded anything at all. Weirdly too, when I picked it up later, the memory log was completely corrupted, just all zeros. Well, I haven't gone exploring since, and To be honest, I don't know when I'm going to go again. When I was 19, I moved back in with my parents after finishing school. We had just bought a modest house on the east side of the city that we lived in. Not the fancy part by any means, but certainly a solid working-class neighborhood. It was the kind of place where people nodded to each other from porches, and stray cats owned the alleys pretty much. It was supposed to be temporary. I had just started community college, saving up while deciding whether to apply for a nursing program or maybe something in healthcare administration. My parents said that I was doing the right thing, staying close to family, keeping practical and all that. I remember thinking that life finally felt steady again after years of uncertainty for me. But that summer I met someone. His name was Adrian. He wasn't from our neighborhood. He actually came to one of my cousin's backyard barbecues with a mutual friend. He was the kind of guy who looked like he knew how to handle himself. A sharp smile, faded tattoos, a jacket even in the heat. He wasn't loud or arrogant though, and when he talked, he sort of leaned in like he was letting you in on a secret. We started texting that night, and a few days later, he asked if I wanted to hang out with him. Said that he knew a little cafe that made the best guava soda in the city. I laughed at that. I mean, who gets excited about guava soda? But his energy was easy and light, and so I said yes. He picked me up around sunset. The plan, he said, was simple. Grab the soda, take a walk, then drive somewhere quiet to watch the city lights. We parked behind a closed thrift store. It had a sun-bleached sign outside and barred windows. The cafe was about a 15-minute walk away, and he said, "Real local spot, you'll love it." The street was nearly empty at this stage. He looked at me and smiled. "You said that you weren't scared of this part of town, remember? Don't tell me that I've got to protect you." I guess my nervousness was pretty obvious, but something in his tone made it sound less like a joke and more like a dare, I guess. In any case, we started walking. Streetlights humming weakly above us. Every few blocks, he stopped to show me something on his phone. Like a meme, a clip, a story, like he was sort of buying time. I remember glancing at the sky, thinking that it was darker than it should have been. That was when I heard a car coming around the corner. A small silver sedan rolled up behind us, engine idling low. I thought that it was going to pass us, but it slowed until it matched our pace. The passenger door opened and a man stepped out, tall, wearing a hoodie pulled low. "Phone and wallet," he said. His voice shook slightly, like he was reading a line that he hadn't rehearsed enough. I froze, and Adrian didn't move. The guy kept his distance, one hand buried in his pocket like he might have had a gun, though I never actually saw one. His breathing sounded uneven, though. "Come on," he said again, louder this time. "I don't want to hurt you." Something about the voice, the hesitation, the way he looked between me and Adrian, made my stomach drop. It didn't seem random. It almost felt like they knew each other. I could feel it, even if I couldn't explain how. He snatched my wallet, but not Adrian's. Then he ran back to the car, and I caught a glimpse of the driver, just a shadow behind the glass, but they pulled off, tires squealing. I turned to Adrian, and he looked strangely calm, almost relieved. "Are you okay?" he asked, way too casually. I said that we should go to the police, and he shook his head. "You really want to deal with that right now? Let's just go and get the soda first. It'll calm you down." He said it like it was nothing, like I hadn't just been robbed. I remember walking the rest of the way in silence, clutching the strap of my bag like it might disappear as well, but at the cafe the lights flickered overhead and Adrian ordered for both of us 2 guava sodas and sat across from me, smiling like we were still on a normal date. When we finally got back to the car, I told him again that I wanted to file a report. He looked at me for a long time before sighing and saying, "Fine, if it'll make you feel better." At the station, things got even more weird too. I told the officer that the car was silver. Adrian, though, said that it was black. I said that there were 2 men, but Adrian said that there was only one. I said that he got into the passenger seat, and Adrian said that he drove off alone. By the end, the officers were giving each other that look, the one that people give you when they've stopped taking you seriously. One of them asked if we had both been drinking, and I said no, and Adrian didn't answer. When we left, he didn't speak until we were almost back at my house, and he said, "You really think that I set you up, huh?" I hadn't said it out loud yet. "You'd be crazy to think that." His voice was quiet, but his jaw was tight. I got out without answering, and after that, I never saw him again, not for months in fact. Then one afternoon I was walking home from the bus stop, and there he was, leaning against a lamppost across the street, smiling faintly like we were old friends. He waved once before turning away. That was 8 years ago now, and I still don't know exactly what happened, but I'm pretty sure that I was set up, and yeah, I'm just glad that nothing else really happened and that only a few personal items were taken in the end. When I was little, my grandmother used to tell me that people like me were open. I didn't know what she meant at the time, but I think that she saw something in me, something that I've only come to understand recently. I've always been sensitive to strange ways, not just emotionally, though that's certainly part of it. What I mean is that I could walk into a room and instantly feel what had happened there before. If someone had argued, if something bad had occurred, it just sort of lingered, like static in the air, and I could never shake that. Even as a kid, I got attached to things that I shouldn't have. I had a shelf filled with like little trinkets that I swore had their own moods. If one felt sad, I'd rearrange everything else so that it wasn't alone. My parents thought that it was pretty cute, maybe a little bit eccentric, of course, but harmless. By the time that I was a teenager, I'd learned to ignore the odd feelings that came with being around old objects or certain people. But when I turned 21, I started actively trying to understand it a bit more. I began reading about intuition, energy, and spiritual channeling. I thought maybe I could use my sensitivity for something meaningful. Who knows, maybe even help some people. I started journaling after meditation, letting my hand move on its own while I focused on the presence that I felt nearby. Sometimes I would draw faces that weren't mine, names that didn't belong to anyone that I knew. I kept everything in a notebook under my bed, and at first it was comforting, really. It felt like proof that I wasn't just imagining things. But after a few months, something changed in the tone of what I was recording. The words became fragmented, darker and repetitive. Things like, "we see you" and "the gate is open." That was also when the atmosphere at my house began to shift with it. The air would feel, I don't know, like heavy, especially on the stairs, as though someone was right behind me. I started hearing soft knocks in the hallway late at night. Sometimes, when I turned off the lights, the space between the furniture looked almost distorted too, like something was there just out of sight. I tried all of the usual things, cleansing rituals, salt lines, prayer. The more that I tried, the worse it seemed to be getting too. I would also wake up with massive pressure on my chest, unable to move, and one morning I found a handprint on the fogged mirror in the bathroom, way too large to be mine or any of my family members. It was way too long in the fingers. Well, the night everything changed, I woke up because the air was absolutely freezing. I could see my breath and the room was just full of shadows, but they weren't still. They were like rippling, like something submerged beneath dark water. I sat up, and for a split second I thought that I saw figures. Thin, blurred people standing along the walls. Their heads were turned toward me, but their faces didn't look human anymore. They looked almost melted. When I screamed, my boyfriend jolted awake. He said that he didn't see them, just me sitting upright and staring at the corner, but a few days later, he confessed something that he'd been keeping to himself. He told me that about a year earlier, before I ever even mentioned the drawings or the presents or anything, he had woken in the middle of the night and saw someone lying beside him, and it wasn't me. He said that she had long black hair and was pale, and what looked like waterlogged skin. She didn't blink and she was just watching him. When he turned the lamp on in a panic, she was then gone, and I was still asleep beside him, breathing normally. He didn't tell me then because he thought that it was a dream, or maybe he was hallucinating or something. But when I described the shadow figures that I had seen, his face went white. That woman, he said, she was standing behind you. I've been trying to tell myself that it's all just stress, that I'm projecting my fears, but I cannot shake the feeling that I've opened something, that maybe all of those nights of connecting weren't what I thought that they were. Sometimes I hear faint voices coming from the walls now, whispering through the wiring or the vents, and they sound almost familiar. So I gathered all of my old journals and trinkets and I took them outside to burn. The flames, they rose high, and for a moment, I could have sworn that I thought that I heard laughter, thin and far away somewhere out in the forest. The fire went out faster than it should have too, like something smothered it from within, but since then, thankfully, the house feels quieter, but I am still remaining vigilant because, I don't know, something tells me that this just isn't over. It was the middle of summer when the four of us decided to do a loop through southern Vermont. A few nights camping, no cell service, just a break from the constant noise of life, really. Our first stop was a small campground tucked near the river, surrounded by dense forest that looked older than the road itself. We arrived before dusk. The air felt strange from the beginning too, still a little bit heavy, and there were no crickets or birds, not even the faint rustle of wind through the leaves. Just the crack of twigs under our boots and the echo of our own voices bouncing way too loudly off of the trees. Feels like someone hit the mute button on nature, my boyfriend joked, trying to sound casual. We all laughed, but we definitely felt like it was off too. Anyway, after dinner we sat around the fire for a while, talking in low voices, and eventually everyone drifted off to their tents. I lay there, staring at the nylon ceiling, waiting for that familiar forest rhythm, a distant owl, a sigh of wind, but it just never came. It was just so still and absolutely quiet. It was so eerie, but sometime after midnight, I must have woken up to what I thought was whispering. It was faint, like two people talking somewhere in the trees, and I held my breath and listened harder, but the sound eventually faded away. But then came the footsteps. They started slow, soft, deliberate, and I could hear the gravel crunch on the loop road just beyond our sight. Someone was walking, pausing every few steps too. Mind you, it was definitely not an animal. Animals move differently. This sounded cautious and human. The steps, they circled once, then again, each time getting closer. At one point, I swear that they stopped just outside of our tent. I could hear weight shifting, fabric rustling. I gripped my boyfriend's arm, but he didn't wake. I lay there frozen, watching the faint shadows of boots move across the thin tent wall. Then, without warning, a sharp, metallic clang sound echoed throughout the night, like someone hitting a steel pipe, or maybe a pan or something. The sound echoed throughout the entire campground, then another and another, and it followed a rhythm, 5 seconds apart it seemed, steady as a metronome. The footsteps started again too, moving with the sound it seemed. Whoever or whatever it was circled the campground twice. I wanted to unzip the tent and look, but I just couldn't bring myself to move. The air felt charged, like static before lightning. My chest was tight with a kind of fear that just didn't make sense. After what felt like forever too, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise had been, too. I don't remember falling asleep again. I just remember lying there until the first hint of dawn. In the morning, I brought it up expecting everyone to laugh it off, but one of our friends, Eric, went pale the moment that I mentioned the sound. He had heard it too. The steady rhythm, the circling, even the pause outside of our tent. We joked about it later, half convincing ourselves that it was a park ranger or some drunk hiker with a stick or something. But when we went out to the ranger station, the woman on duty frowned when we mentioned it. No one's supposed to be walking through the sites after 10, she said, and if someone was, we would have seen it on the night patrol. We were there around that time. That evening, as we packed up to leave, I noticed something strange in the dirt near our fire pit too. A single boot print, larger than any of ours, facing the tent. And beside it, half buried under the pine needles, was a bent metal spoon. It looked old, blackened by the fire it seemed, but we left before sunset that day. The woods felt different in the light, but I couldn't shake the memory of that steady metallic rhythm echoing through the dark like that, knowing that somebody was out there. A few weeks later, curiosity got the better of me too, so I looked up the history of that campground, wondering if anyone else had experienced something similar. There really wasn't much, a few vague mentions on forums, nothing concrete. But buried in an old local article, I found a single line about a man who apparently used to live in those woods back in the 1970s. They called him the Watcher. Apparently, he had lost his family in a fire, and after that he refused to leave the area. Hikers claim that they had heard him walking through the trees at night, tapping on the trunks with something metal to make sure the forest was still alive. When someone finally went looking for him, they found his camp completely empty, just a burned-out pan and footprints that led straight into the river. The article also said that no one ever found a body and he was never seen again. When I was 24, I picked up seasonal work at a fall attraction just outside of town. One of those sprawling farm setups with like corn mazes, haunted barns, and hay rides that loop through the woods. I'd been between jobs and I figured that a few weekends scaring people would be easy money. The section that I worked in was near the end of the hayride route, where the tractor passed through a bit of a stretch. Our set was pretty simple. An old circus tent with flickering lights, carnival music, and actors dressed as clowns that would dart out when the wagons rolled through. It was loud, chaotic, and honestly kind of fun. Behind the tent, though, were nothing but trees, a dense patch of woods that ran along the back of the property. There was a dirt path that led out there, probably used by staff years ago, but no one really went past the first few yards for the most part. Even during the day, it always felt dim back there, like the canopy just never let the sunlight through. Well, on one of the last weekends in October, I took my usual break after a hayride group had passed, and it must have been close to midnight. The crowd noise had faded toward the main field, and for the first time that night, things were quiet. I sat on a plastic crate by the side of the tent, lit a cigarette, and I scrolled through my phone while the wind pushed dead leaves along the trail. The moon was unusually bright that night, so much so that I didn't even need my flashlight tonight. That's when I noticed movement on the path, slow, deliberate, and heavy enough to crunch the gravel. At first I thought it was someone from another section heading back to the staff area, but the shape was wrong. It was pale, almost luminescent in the moonlight, and tall, unnaturally tall. I would guess that it was at least 8 foot tall from what I could tell, maybe more though, and it was also sort of walking on all fours, its limbs far too long for its body, bending at angles that made my stomach tighten just watching it move. I sort of sat there frozen. It wasn't fear at first, but more like my brain just couldn't decide what I was seeing. This thing's gait was uneven though, almost glitching. What I mean is that it would step forward, pause mid-motion, and then continue in a different rhythm entirely, like its body just couldn't keep up with itself. Then it turned its head toward me. Now, I say head, but it wasn't really a face on this thing, just a smooth, pale surface where features should have been. But I knew that it was looking at me, though. I could feel it. My hands began to tremble so badly that I dropped everything that I was holding. It didn't stop moving, though. It just sort of kept drifting along the path, slow and silent, its outline warping slightly every few seconds, like it was stepping through layers of air that didn't match the rest of the world. When it reached the bend in the trail, it leaned its body sideways, like it was observing me from a different perspective, and then slipped behind the trees and it vanished. I sat there for maybe a minute, not even moving. Then I bolted to the other side of the tent, where a few co-workers were talking near the generator. I must have looked like hell too, because one of them asked if I was sick, and I told them what I saw, half expecting them to laugh at me, but instead there was just a really long pause. Finally, one of the older guys, a guy who had worked there for nearly a decade now, just said quietly, "You saw it too, huh?" He then told me that apparently a handful of people over the years had claimed to see something in those woods. Always white, always sort of faceless, always walking along that same trail. One girl quit mid-season after seeing it, leaning halfway out of the trees during her smoke break. The owner supposedly had the area sealed off for a few years, but the sightings never stopped once it reopened. No one could ever get a photo of it, because phones would always freeze or lights would flicker when it appeared. Some of them said that it just didn't like to be noticed, but that once you see it, it makes sure that you never do again. I laughed it off at the time, but I also didn't take another break alone after that too. When the season ended, I promised myself that I would forget about it, and mostly I did, until 2 weeks ago when an old co-worker messaged me out of the blue, and he sent me a photo that someone took near this place, a blurry moonlit shot of the trail, and there seemed to be something pale or sort of obscured standing halfway down the path. Too tall for any person, its limbs blurred and its shape wrong in that same impossible way. Again, it was super blurry, so hard to tell, but because I had seen this thing before, I am confident that that is some sort of a photo of whatever this thing is. It was late summer in a small Iowa town. I'd been living there for a few months, renting the upstairs of an old house on the edge of town. My tap water at the time had that terrible taste to it, and even my cat wouldn't drink it. So every few nights I would walk to the park to fill bottles from the public fountain. It wasn't too far, maybe 10 minutes, and I liked the quiet anyway, so it wasn't a big problem. That night though, the quiet wasn't comforting. The main street was still alive when I passed through it. The old bar on the corner was spilling yellow light into the street, the jukebox muffled through the brick walls, and I'd been there 100 times, enough that the bartenders knew my drink and the regulars knew my name at this stage. I wasn't planning on going in, but when someone waved at me through the window, I stopped for just one. Inside, there was plenty of beer and laughter and the same handful of men that were there at usual tables, the kind who just never seemed to go home. They were already deep into that glassy-eyed drunk that looks more like a trance than a buzz. They smiled when I walked in. I waved, they nodded, and I kept my distance. When the bar closed and I headed toward the park to get the water that I needed, I saw them again though, all three. They were sitting outside a shuttered insurance office across the street, smoking and talking way too loud. Their words stumbled over each other, just drunken nonsense really, until one of them called out, "Hey, you new around here?" I almost laughed at that, mainly because everyone in the town asked that. I said yeah, and I was new, and I just sort of kept walking. They started with the usual questions, where I lived, if I had a boyfriend, what I was doing out so late, and I just answered vaguely, then excused myself to get water for my cat. That was when I heard it. The screaming. It came from somewhere down the street, sharp and high-pitched, literally cutting through the night. For a second I froze, but I then realized that it didn't sound human. In fact, it was a cat, somewhere nearby, and something had it cornered or caught. The sound stopped abruptly, like someone had flipped a switch, and when I looked back, one of the men had disappeared, and the other two were watching me, one of them smiling faintly. I hurried across the street into the park. It was nearly 4 a.m. at this stage. The lamps were those old ones that dim and flicker orange halos that barely touched the ground. The fountain stood near the middle of the path, just a dark shape surrounded by open grass. I crouched beside it, filled my bottles one by one, trying not to think about how silent it was again. And then I noticed movement across the street, a figure ducking behind a parked car. And it was definitely the same man from before, the one who had been smiling. He crouched low as if trying to open the door, but no dome light came on, no alarm chirped, and he just sort of sat there motionless. I capped the last bottle and turned toward the exit. That was when I saw the second man, sitting alone now on the steps of another building, closer than before. His cigarette ember flared as he exhaled. He said something that I couldn't hear, and upon seeing that, I walked faster. Thankfully, a police cruiser rolled up then, its headlights cutting through the dark. The night shift officer, someone that I knew from around town, leaned out of his window. "You okay?" he asked. "We got some calls about someone screaming. We saw you here and thought that maybe it was you." I told him then that it was a cat, and he nodded slowly but didn't look convinced. "Hey, if those guys bother you," he said, "call the station." Then he drove off, tires crunching gravel. I started home, cutting through the quieter streets past rows of sleeping houses. The street lights were fewer here, and the darkness definitely thickened pretty quickly. My footsteps sounded way too loud for my liking on the sidewalk now. And then came the psst. I spun around. The man who had been behind the car was now standing at the corner, half hidden by a shadow. Across the street, the other one appeared, his head tilted, hands in his pockets. They didn't say anything at first, and they just watched. Then, one of them made a sort of soft clicking sound like you'd use to call a dog. That broke whatever was left of my nerves, and so, instantly, I ran. I didn't look back until I'd cut through a back alley, hidden behind a dumpster, and I waited. I could hear their footsteps on the pavement for a while, slow and steady, not running and not rushing, and just walking. I waited there for some time, and when it finally went quiet again, I took a different route home. My whole body was shaking, and half the water that I had collected had spilled out by now, and even one of the bottles was broken. I never saw them at the bar again after that. The staff said that they hadn't been back since that night, which was strange. I mean, they were regulars for years. Someone said that they might have been from the next town over, in fact, and that they were just passing through. But when I mentioned the park and the noise, the bartender's face changed a bit. "Yeah, there used to be trouble there," she said quietly. "Back before they put up the lights, some girl went missing years ago. They said that she was seen walking toward the fountain with a group of men, apparently, and that's the last anyone saw of her." And well, as you can probably imagine, I didn't go back to that park after that, ever again. For weeks I had been trying to convince myself that the man downstairs was just lonely. That was easier than admitting that he actually frightened me. He lived directly below my condo, in a unit, and seemed to appear whenever I stepped outside. Sometimes he was already there, sitting on the bench by the mailbox, motionless, as if waiting for something. Other times I would catch a flash of movement through the stairwell window just as I reached for the door. He never smiled exactly, but his mouth stayed slightly open, like he was always about to say something but just never did. Lately, I had taken to smoking only during the day, because at least in daylight, the strange quiet around him just didn't feel so heavy. At night, the wasps came out though, big black and white things that thudded against the balcony rail. They landed on me sometimes, enormous and slow-moving, like they were curious, but I started smoking downstairs because of this by the garage instead, telling myself that it was just a temporary thing. And that is where it happened. It was late afternoon, warm enough for the air to shimmer above the pavement. I was halfway through a cigarette when the door to 3B cracked open. He shuffled out, wearing the same wrinkled grey sweater that I'd seen him in all week, and without a word, he sat beside me on the concrete ledge, way too close. Nice day," I said, just to break the silence a bit. He didn't answer right away. Then, in a thin, oddly high voice, he said, "You came back." I frowned. "Back?" He smiled faintly. "You said that you would. You promised." It wasn't the first odd thing that he had said to me, but the repetition in his tone made my skin prickle. I tried to keep my voice light. "I don't think that I did, but okay, maybe you're thinking of someone else?" He shook his head and said it again, louder this time. "You promised." Something in the way that he said it, slow, deliberate, with a childlike cadence, made the hair rise on my arms. I started to stand. He reached out, catching my wrist. His grip wasn't hard, but it was wrong. It was too steady. I laughed nervously, trying to pull back. "Hey, I've got to go upstairs, but I'll see you later, okay?" He didn't let go. His voice dropped lower, almost trembling. "You said you would come down. You said that we would hang out." My stomach twisted. "You never answered my text," I blurted out, hoping that logic would fix whatever loop his mind was stuck in. That was when his face changed. His jaw tightened, and the pale blue of his eyes seemed to lose focus. "You're lying," he whispered. "You're lying again." He yanked my arm, and I stumbled forward a step before wrenching myself free. He staggered and hit the side of the building, then straightened up slowly, way too slowly. And for one horrible second, I thought, genuinely, that he was about to lunge again, right at me. And so, I ran. By the time that I had reached my floor, I was crying so hard that I could barely see. My husband opened the door before I even touched the knob, and I must have looked wild, shaking, gasping, trying to explain what happened, and he instantly called the police. They came, talked to both of us, and then went downstairs to question him. Through the window, I saw the flashlight lights wash over the courtyard. One of the officers gestured toward the man's apartment. The door to 3B was wide open. I couldn't see much, just the faint outline of furniture, and on the floor a pile of what sort of looked like folded women's clothing. The officer came back a few minutes later and told us that he had spoken to the man, said that he seemed confused and possibly medicated, and that it was probably best if we avoided further contact with him. That was all. No arrest, no warning, just a soft suggestion that didn't feel like enough. That night, I didn't sleep too. I kept thinking about how cold his hand felt, how certain that he had sounded when he said that I promised. 3 days later, I went down to meet my father out front. He was stopping by for lunch. The sun was bright, the air heavy with that sharp, early autumn smell of dying leaves. I almost convinced myself that everything was normal again. But then I heard it. That same thin, reedy voice. "Hey." He was standing by the dumpster this time, hands folded like a child in a school portrait. "You're leaving again?" Before I could answer, my dad's car turned the corner. He saw the man, got out, and said something that I couldn't hear, firm and commanding though, and the man flinched, took a few steps backward, and then literally bolted around the side of the building. Genuinely, I thought that would be the end of it too. But that night, as I was locking the balcony door, I noticed something on the glass. A small handprint. Not dusty, not oily, but faintly wet, like condensation pressed from the outside. Mind you, we live on the 4th floor, and I don't smoke out there anymore. I don't walk past the garage anymore, not even in daylight, and I really don't know what's going to happen, but I'm certainly going to be very, very cautious. When I first started working at Lumen, it felt like stepping into the version of my life that I'd imagined when I was 16. The glass storefront, the soft music, the endless rails of silk and linen that shimmered beneath white light, it all felt like a small kind of perfection. My co-workers were kind too, quick with jokes and advice, and I found myself actually looking forward to the long shifts. The store? It smelled faintly of cedar and perfume, and I loved the quiet rhythm of it all, steaming clothes in the back room, chatting with customers about what they might wear to a wedding, folding stacks of cotton shirts until they were smooth as paper. It felt safe, and that was the part that hurt the most later, how safe it had felt. You see, the man who owned the store, Mr. Laird, was in his 50s. I'd always thought of him as a distant but polite person. He didn't talk much, but when he did, he spoke softly, as if the air itself might shatter if he raised his voice. He wasn't around often, only coming in to restock or handle shipments. But when he did, everyone straightened a little bit, eager to stay on his good side. That afternoon, the store was buzzing in its usual low hum, customers drifting between aisles, faint static from the overhead speakers. Mr. Laird came in through the back, carrying a few boxes of men's outwear, and asked if I'd help him shelve them. The men's section was nearly empty at this stage, dimmer than the rest of the store because of one of the overhead bulbs, had burnt out weeks ago, I think. It had a sort of stillness to it, though, like the light didn't reach that corner properly. We unpacked the coats in silence. I had to reach for one of the higher shelves, standing on the low edge of the display rack. The ledge was solid, though, barely 2 inches off the ground, but I heard him step closer behind me. I thought that he was going to hand me another hanger, but instead I felt his hands, cold and firm, suddenly wrap around my throat. He leaned close enough for his breath to brush my ear. His voice was low and level when he said, "If you do that again, I'll kill you." It wasn't shouted, wasn't even said with anger. It sounded true. For a moment, I thought that I had misheard him, but when I turned, his expression hadn't changed. He stood there, calm as ever, and said something about safety, how the shelving wasn't meant to hold weight, as though that explained his behavior. I couldn't answer. My vision tunneled. My hands began to shake, and I tried to tell myself that it was just a misunderstanding, a cruel joke, anything but what it really was. A deliberate act, quiet and practiced. The strange part was that when he took his hands away, I didn't move. I stood there, in that position, one hand still gripping the shelf until he had gone to the back room. The rest of the shift, it sort of passed in fragments for me that day. My co-workers talked to me and I nodded at the right moments, but I don't remember their words. I remember the sound of the air conditioner cycling on and off, and how every few minutes I thought that I could still feel his fingers resting on my skin. Not pressure, but just presence. He left without saying goodbye that day. When I got home that night, I told my boyfriend about what had happened. He wanted to drive down there, storm in, and get this guy into his own hands. My mother cried. My friend from work texted, saying that she would speak to management, but she sounded nervous and a bit hesitant. Others, she said, had complained before, whispering things about him standing too close, watching too long, things like this, but nothing ever really came of it. I struggled to sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadow of the burned-out light in the men's section, the one that had never been replaced before. It wasn't until later, too, that I remembered something strange about it. That when he had come near me, the shadows on the wall behind us just hadn't really looked right. They had moved the wrong way, bending toward him, it seemed, instead of away. I don't know if I was just imagining that or not, but it was weird. Well, the next morning I called the work safety agency, gave them a statement, and I quit that day. Genuinely too, I thought that would be the end of it. But 2 weeks later, one of my old co-workers called. She said that Mr. Laird hadn't been seen in since that day. His office was locked, and when they'd finally gotten to the property manager to open it, the inside was completely empty. Not tidied up, but empty, completely stripped. No computer, no papers, no boxes, nothing but an old mirror leaning against the wall. She told me that sometimes, late at night when she closes, she also hears the automatic doors open on their own. She'll look up, but the security camera monitor always goes black for just a second. She doesn't really know what to make of it, but it only started after what happened to me. And she swears that the last time that it happened, the light over the men's section flickered back to life again. She said that she felt stupid saying this, but for a moment, she said, she saw a tall shape standing there, just under the hum of the white light. It was only there for a very brief moment, and she blinked and it was gone, but she could have sworn that something was there. I personally don't know what to make of any of this, but if you have any ideas as to what any of this is all about, well, I would love to hear your theories. Thanks for listening. I've lived in this town my whole life, and nothing ever really happens here. It's the sort of place that is way too small for crime, and also too quiet for comfort. Just a few rows of houses pressed against a river, one main street, one pub, one shop. That's it. After dark, it genuinely feels like the whole place exhales and goes still here as well. So, it was about 10 when I decided to walk to the corner shop. I'd been watching something on TV, but the picture had started flickering in that way that sometimes does when the fog rolls in here. I needed some milk, and the air outside looked soft and white, like breath trapped in glass, and I put my coat on and stepped out. The streets, they were empty, not just quiet, but completely empty. Even the usual sounds of the town were gone now. No distant cars, no dog barking, just the buzz of the streetlights and the slap of my shoes on the wet pavement. The shop was nearly closed when I got there too. The woman at the counter didn't say much, just scanned the bottle of milk and muttered something about the temperature dropping quickly. When I stepped back out, there was a man standing by the cash machine under the yellow light. He wasn't using it, he was just sort of standing there facing the glass door, almost like he had been waiting for someone to come out. His hood was up, but he wasn't dressed like someone homeless or wandering. His clothes looked neat, in fact. Almost too neat, actually. He didn't turn toward me, but I felt that tightening in my chest that only happens when something is wrong, even if you cannot say why, but I started walking home. Halfway down the hill, I heard footsteps from behind me. At first, they were faint and slow, keeping distance, an echo just out of sync with my own. I crossed to the opposite side of the street and heard the same shift behind me. The air was thick with fog by then, swallowing the shapes of things, and I could only just see far enough to make out the next lamppost, maybe the next patch of wet road as well, but when I stopped, so did the sound. I remember the exact sound too, the scrape of soles catching grit, not closer and not farther, but just staying just out of view. I pulled my phone out, though there was no signal on that stretch of road. I pretended to scroll, to look busy. I thought that maybe I was being paranoid, that maybe he lived nearby, that maybe I would make a fool of myself if I ran. So I kept walking. By the time I turned onto my street, my hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped my keys. The houses on this end are pretty close together, but the lamps don't reach all the way to my door. And I could hear his steps still, slow, steady, pacing the rhythm of mine. I didn't dare look back until I was at my doorstep. When I finally turned the key and slipped inside, the sound stopped. I pressed myself to the wall beside the front window, the thin curtain between us, and peeked through it. And he was standing at the edge of the lamplight, facing my house. The fog was thicker now, turning everything into washed-out grey, but I could see enough. His hands tucked into his sleeves, his head tilted slightly as if listening. He didn't move. He didn't smoke, didn't reach for a phone, just stood there, the light bending around him. After maybe half a minute, he turned and he just disappeared into the mist. I kept expecting to hear the gravel crunch outside again during the night or the slow drag of footsteps along the curb, but I didn't. When morning came, I almost convinced myself that it had just been fear, a trick of the fog, or just my nerves, my imagination feeding off of the quiet, that the guy wasn't there to hurt me or do anything sinister, that I had just misread the whole situation. Until I stepped outside. There were footprints on the path leading right up to my door, and I know that they were not mine. Large, deep ones, and not just a few as well. They circled twice, stopping directly in front of the letterbox. You see, it had rained overnight, so they couldn't have lasted unless someone had been there close to dawn. And again, I know that they're not mine. I followed the trail to the corner of the street, but that's when they just stopped. Not faded, mind you, but just stopped, almost like the person had just stepped into nothing. All day I've been hearing things outside too. Not loud, but just small sounds that really don't fit the rhythm of this place. A shift of gravel, a creak of the gate. Once just before sunset, I thought that I heard 3 slow knocks at the door, spaced evenly, like someone wanted me to know that they were still there. I'm still trying to tell myself that it's the wind or a cat or the sound of the old pipes in the wall, but every time that fog rolls past that window, I swear that I see faint shapes outside, tall and still, facing the house. I've ordered a camera for the front step, though I don't know if I'll ever look at what it records, to be honest. I'm genuinely afraid that my place is being cased out, and I just don't know what to do. This all happened during COVID times when I decided to visit my old friend Ben. We hadn't spoken much since the year before, but he had moved to a weathered coastal town about 2 hours south, and I'd been craving something like normalcy. The roads were empty, the sky clear, the radio full of half-hopeful voices saying that it would all be over soon. His new place was small, a sloping bungalow at the edge of a cliff that overlooked the sea. It was the kind of house that seemed to belong more to the wind than the people living in it, but when I pulled up, I found Ben outside painting on the porch. His partner, Mara, she stood beside him in the salt-heavy sunlight, her dark hair swept back, and she had a cigarette in her hand. Mara was kind, but very quiet. She had this sort of careful way of speaking, in fact, as though every word had to be weighed before being released. Over dinner, she told me a little bit about her father, too, a fisherman who had raised her and her sister after her mother disappeared when they were children. She said that she had died of cancer the year before, and she showed me a photograph on the mantel, a man with a deep tan and laughing eyes, his arm around 2 young girls by a dock. She touched the frame before sitting it back down. That night, we stayed up drinking by the windows. The air smelled like salt all night. Mara told me that she still dreamt of her father sometimes, not in words or images, but as a bit of a presence, like the tide pulling at the edges of her sleep. When I left just after midnight, she was sitting out back with a lantern beside her, staring toward the dark horizon. The world, it began to shrink after that. Borders closed, movement stopped. I talked to Ben over the phone sometimes, and he said that they were both fine, though Mara had grown more withdrawn over time. He joked that she had taken to collecting driftwood from the beach and arranging it in strange little piles around the garden. He called them her little offerings. Months later, when the restrictions were at their worst, I went into the nearby city for groceries at one point. The mall was almost empty, even though it was mid-afternoon, though it certainly felt like evening already with such a lack of people. The light was dim and grey through the skylights, and that was when I saw her. Mara. She was walking down the opposite side of the corridor, but she looked thinner, paler, her hair pulled back the same way that it had been the day by the sea when I saw her. But her eyes, they looked wrong somehow. Not scared exactly, but more like she was trying very hard to remember something. I called her name, but she didn't stop. She passed me with this strange focus, her gaze sliding over my face like I just wasn't really there. I almost followed her, but by the time that I'd turned the corner, she was gone. When I got home that evening, the phone rang. It was Ben, and he sounded hollow, like he hadn't spoken for days. He told me that he had come home from work that afternoon and found Mara in the backyard. She had apparently collapsed by the stairs, the same place that she always sat to smoke, and the doctors said that it had happened early that morning. Honestly, I didn't know what to say. I just sort of remember standing there, the dull buzz of the fridge filling the silence between us. I didn't tell him what I had seen, but it's been years now, and I think about that day often. The mall has long since reopened, filled again with ordinary noise of life, but whenever I walk past that same location, I always think back to that moment. Sometimes I tell myself that I was just seeing things, or it was just a reflection or something, but if I'm being completely honest, really, I don't believe that. I've been riding in the southern forest since I was a kid. Out here, the land sort of folds in on itself too. Ridges, bluffs, creek beds, you name it. You could ride all day and still not see another person. Well, a few months ago, I took my mare Daisy out for a long trail ride with my friend Claire. Her mother ran a campground along the edge of the Shawnee National Forest, and we had made plans to follow one of the older bridle paths that cut across the low valley and looped back around through the pines there. We left just after sunrise. The air was clear that day, and it was a really good day. Claire's mother's dog, a big shepherd mix named Hank, he trotted ahead of us, tail wagging like he owned the place. It was just one of those perfect mornings. Birds singing, the sound of hooves on packed dirt, the rhythm of creeks passing beneath us, and we had been riding for maybe 2 hours when we came to a fork in the trail. The main path followed the creek, but there was a new sign nailed to a tree where another trail branched upward toward the ridge. Someone had scrawled, "Caution, difficult terrain," in bright orange paint there. I had heard talk of it around, how it wasn't properly cleared yet, how it ran too close to the cliffs and all that. We decided to stay on the creek route instead. Just as we started around the base of the hill, Hank darted ahead into the tall grass, barking once before vanishing from sight. Claire called after him, but the only sound that came back was the creek moving slow through the stones. We heard something too, and at first I thought it was Hank, a sort of high broken yelp like he had caught his paw on something or hurt himself. But it didn't stop. The sound rose and sort of cracked and turned into this awful wailing all of a sudden, like an animal suffering while it was dying. I've worked in animal rescue for years, and I would say that I've heard pretty much everything by this point. Pain, fear, panic, but this was different. It was almost like something was mimicking the sound of a dog, without knowing what made it real. Well, the horses instantly froze. I could feel Daisy's muscles tightening under me and her ears flickering toward the hill. The sound was coming up from there, and it was somewhere on that new trail. Maybe somebody's dog was hurt, Claire said, already calling out hello and is anybody there, but there was no answer. We moved slowly through the creek, trying to get a better look, but the trees grew thick on that slope and nothing was moving. But the wailing, it kept going, steady, and sort of terrifying now, until the moment our horses turned away. Then it suddenly stopped, just like that. Let me tell you as well that the silence that followed was way worse than the noise itself. We didn't speak again, not until we reached the open ground on the other side. Claire looked pale, and I probably did too. I mean, there was no one else out there that day as far as we could tell. Not a sound and not even a squirrel moved in the brush, only the birds and the creek. By the time that we made it back to camp, we had convinced ourselves that it was probably just a coyote or something. Maybe it was a sick one, or maybe stuck somewhere, but Claire, she just couldn't let it go. On the ride back too that afternoon, she asked if we could take the new trail, just to be sure, and I really did not want to, but in the end she convinced me. The path, it climbed steeply and wound around the bluff higher than I expected. The ground was soft with moss and the light felt wrong, dim even though it was midday. When we reached the top, the trail leveled out into a clearing that looked recently cut. Trees stood in sort of odd rows, their trunks scored by something sharp. There were no paw prints, no feathers, no sign of a struggle or anything, just a bit of a mess. But near the center of the clearing, the ground was blackened. Not burnt exactly, but more like something had bled maybe onto the dirt long ago. Hank started whining upon seeing it, circling and tail down. Claire called his name, and for a moment, I swear that I heard something answer. A distant noise deeper in the woods, just once, but drawn out and long. I don't know what that was, but we left without saying another word. The next day, I went out early to check on the horses, and Daisy was pacing in her pen, nostrils flared, eyes fixed on the tree line. Later, Claire told me that she had apparently gone back up there alone before sunrise, which I thought was absolutely crazy. She said the trail was different now, though, that the clearing was gone, replaced by thick undergrowth and fallen branches. I never went back myself to confirm that, but look, I don't think that she's lying. I have heard stories of skinwalkers and the forest doing odd things elsewhere from other people, so who knows? Maybe it is something like that, or maybe she just got lost somewhere along the way and thought that she was at the clearing but wasn't. Either way, I know what I heard personally, and I won't be going riding up there again. When I was little, I thought that my family was just eccentric. The kind of people who made meaning out of coincidences and swore the dead could still eavesdrop. They would whisper things like, "We attract the old ones," or "Magdalena left the door open too wide again." I never really understood what they meant, only that they said it with a strange mix of fear and sort of pride. Now that I'm older, though, I wish that I had never learned what they were talking about. My great-grandmother, Magdalena, came from Lithuania during war times. My father says that she crossed the sea with nothing but a wool coat, a pocket knife, and a set of rosary beads that weren't hers. No one ever explained where she had gotten them from, but she just never let them go. When she died, they went missing before the funeral, apparently, and my aunt swore that they had been on the bedside table that morning. After her passing, the family stopped talking about her at all. The stories, the superstitions, the rituals, all of it faded like it had been rehearsed for a generation and then deliberately forgotten. But forgetting, it doesn't always work, right? The first time that I noticed something strange, I was staying at my grandmother's farmhouse. It sat on a patch of dry land surrounded by broken fencing and overgrown wheat. Catherine was a bit of a storyteller, let me tell you, the kind who could make a breeze sound haunted. I used to think that she would exaggerate for fun too, until one night when she told us about the tapping. She said that after her husband died, she started feeling someone tapping on her lower back when she tried to sleep. Gentle at first, like a finger tracing a message, and she thought that it was a dream until the dog started growling at the empty hallway. She moved to the couch for weeks after that, but the tapping, it seemed to follow her there too. Now, as a kid, I honestly thought that it was just an old woman's fantasy, and I didn't realize at the time just how much those stories were a warning. Years later, I stayed with my aunt for a few months in a housing complex. It was on the edge of town, and everyone said that the place was built over an old burial site. Not that anyone respected that fact, but yeah, it was mentioned. It was sort of half parking lot and half scrubland, really, but One night when I was about 10, I looked up the staircase and I saw a little girl at the landing. She wore a dress too thin for winter, and she seemed to be holding like a broken doll by the hair or something. She didn't look at me, she just whispered something that I couldn't understand and then literally vanished behind the wall. I told my aunt, expecting her to laugh, but instead she went pale and called her son into the room. He told me that he had seen her too, years before, the same girl, the same place, holding the same doll. After that, my aunt sprinkled salt across every doorway and made us sleep in the living room for 3 nights at least. At that time, I thought that I had imagined the whole thing, but when I asked my cousin about it years later, he got quiet and he said that it wasn't a girl that he had seen, but it was something pretending to be a girl. That line always stuck with me too, because it was quite creepy to think about. Well, my family has always brushed up against strange things and shapes in doorways, faces in windows, voices calling from rooms that nobody's in. My father told me once about driving home late with his brother, seeing their grandmother's silhouette washing dishes through the kitchen window of an empty house, and he said that she looked peaceful, scrubbing a plate and holding it to the light the way that she always had. When they went inside, the sink was dry though, the window latched, and there was no one there. He told it like it was funny, but personally, I never really found it that funny. The older I got too, the harder it became to dismiss these things, especially after the night that I decided to prove that none of this was real. So my friends and I had heard of a haunted road out near the quarry, a strip of cracked asphalt lined with some trees and the occasional rusted mailbox. I brought a cheap camera, determined to catch nothing, but we walked into the dark laughing and pretending not to be nervous. And when we looked back at the photos later, every image with me in it had the same thing. There was what looked like a ball of light hovering near my shoulder. Now, this was not a lens flare, not a dust or a bug, just this faint pale sphere. It almost looked like a second moon, in fact. And whatever it was, it seemed to follow me for years after that. Not visibly, because I never saw it again in photos, but I would sort of feel it, I guess you could say. It sort of felt like the way that someone stands behind you and you just sort of know that someone's there. It's like the hairs on the back of my neck were rising when I would walk past mirrors, and I would sense something waiting for me in my dreams, always just off to the side of me. And look, I know that that's weird to say, but that's just what it felt like. My friends used to joke that I had a sixth sense because of this, and I just brushed it off as intuition, a coincidence, or maybe something that I'd learned from my family's paranoia. Who knows? Sometimes, though, I could predict things before they would happen. Small things, too, very uncanny. Like my husband asked me once how I knew the neighbor's cat would die before we found it on the road. Honestly, I didn't have an answer then, and I still don't now. I just sort of felt it. A few years ago, I tried to trace Magdalena's old belongings too, the rosary beads specifically, and I wanted something tangible from her life, something to connect all the pieces, but there's just no record of them in any estate papers. Also, no one remembers seeing them after her body was taken too, which is weird, right? My father insists that she was buried with them. My aunt swears that she wasn't, and I don't know what the truth is, but all I know is that weird things happen with my family, and this is just another one of those mysteries. So this one time, I was at Walmart with my dad. But this wasn't a large Walmart. It was one of those neighborhood grocery store or smaller versions. I believe I was about 8 or 9, and I'm now in my 30s. We were grocery shopping like any other night. On this particular night, my dad and I were walking towards the exit after checking out when suddenly my dad realized that he'd forgot the toilet paper. He hadn't exited the store quite yet, and we're right outside of the bathroom or drinking fountains, which, from what I have seen, are typically placed in the same general location in most Walmarts. And my dad said, "Wait right here by the basket, buddy, and I'll be right back." This wasn't unusual, since I was allowed to go and grab things that I needed on my own, like shampoo and whatnot. and I knew to be on my guard at all times. Now, it couldn't have been more than 2 minutes that I found myself being approached by a man. To be honest, I really can't remember much else other than the fact that he was a man and was a lot older than me. I really can't remember his face or height or what he was wearing. The rest is pretty much a total blur, but this man came up to me and said, "Hey." I remember looking up at the man as I gripped the handles of the basket. "I have puppies in my car," he said. "I've also got candy." You know, the whole spiel all of our parents warned us about. The man began to wave me toward him and reached his hand out, as though he would place it on my shoulder. I held onto the basket handle as tight as I could, and in that exact moment, I heard my dad shout, "Hey." It was almost an actual roar as well. The man, he reacted instantly and moved so quickly through the exit doors that it almost looked like he evaporated. My dad, he grabbed me and was likely putting together the pieces faster than my little brain was processing the whole thing. Since nothing actually came of this though, I can't say for sure what the man's motives were. Regardless though, my dad will always be my hero, and I'll never forget the lesson I learned that day about the importance of being aware of your surroundings at all times, no matter how often you have been somewhere or how comfortable you may feel there. I live a little ways out in the woods, on a small dirt road with a few neighbours who also live on our small street. It's a quiet place, I guess. We all know each other and get along pretty decently. Given that we host little bonfires sometimes and invite the neighbours around to grill and have a few drinks, we often discuss things that we've seen lately in our little patch of the forest. A group of lovely deer, a mischievous raccoon, or the odd wandering bear often are topics of conversation. However, inevitably, we often end up on the subject of a mutual experience most of us have had with unexplainable phenomena happening around our homes. It's really no secret that my woods tend to make people a bit uneasy. It's dark, it's quiet, and that tends to make people a bit tense. I'm definitely no different too. I mean, I don't go outside after dark if I don't have to, and I get spooked at times when an animal makes a ruckus. There are some things though that I just cannot attribute to animals. To start though, I have to go all the way back to when I was 13, when I first moved onto this property. I often felt watched at night, I guess you could say. I was terrified to sleep without the lights on. I tried my best to ignore it, but I was honestly terrified to be outside at night or to be here alone. For my 14th birthday, I decided to face my fears so I could pitch a tent outside and camp in the yard with a few good friends. One of them left in the middle of the night because they were so anxious. Another left early in the morning after barely sleeping all night. The last friend stayed a couple of extra days, but was creeped out the entire time that we were there. She claimed to have briefly seen the apparition of a pale woman with dark hair as well, standing in our yard, and allegedly felt something touch her at night. She was truly terrified, and I could tell that she was being honest. Like when I tapped her shoulder once, she startled very easily and almost hit me out of fright. This was very abnormal for her, and I spoke to my uncle who lives next door about the woman that she saw, and to my surprise, he claimed to have also seen the same apparition multiple times. He wasn't even surprised when I brought it up. I moved out not long after this, but recently I've moved back here. Since returning as an adult, I've heard several stories from my family and neighbors about weird phenomena like this too. My uncle has seen the lady, but also shadow figures, and heard some unnatural noises coming from the woods at night. As a man who has lived out here for over 40 years at this point, he's very familiar with the unusual sounds of animals and nature, and he didn't think that these sounds were natural. His wife has also seen shadow figures and weird masses of black energy. She claimed to have been pushed over by an unseen force after witnessing one of these black masses of energy, and she has never gone outside at night since then. My grandmother claimed to have been chased by a shadow entity several years ago on this property while walking back from my uncle's place, It stopped at her front door and watched her while she cried and called my aunt and uncle for help. Understandably too, and they told her to light some sage after this. A couple of neighbors have claimed to have seen similar shadow figures, as well as the apparition of the lady on occasion. I still feel watched, and I regularly cleanse my house to keep, well, whatever this is, out there as far from my home as possible. A good friend of mine, when I first moved back in, called me with concerns over a dream that she had too. This was before she had even set foot on my property. She described my property perfectly, and described seeing the same pale woman that multiple people now have seen. I was understandably shaken by this, considering that she'd not once been to my home at the time, and I hadn't really discussed the weird happenings with her at all. She did spend the night one time, but after that just refused to do it again. My street is honestly super creepy, and I've come to accept that something more is here. With all of the shared experiences, I just cannot deny that something is out there now. It's been here a long time from what I can tell, and seems to make itself known to anyone who spends enough time here. For context, this teacher was in his late 50s to 60s and was highly respected in the small Central Californian community that I lived in at the time. He was the AP economics teacher at my high school. This took place about 15 years ago when I was a senior. I remember several weird experiences with this teacher, like one day in class, and I don't know how it was brought up, but Mr. Smith decided that he was going to give our class a mental exercise. I didn't think anything of it, but then again, I was a pretty innocent and naive teenager at the time. The class went along with it and didn't see an issue with this, but I remember him saying that he was also a psychology professor at the local university. Anyway, he told the class to close our eyes and meditate for a few minutes, and begin thinking about immersing ourselves in a body of water. He said that it was okay if we envisioned a river, a creek, an ocean, or whatever, but he stressed that it had to be water that we were imagining ourselves in. So I began letting the thoughts come, and I imagined myself next to a creek bed, throwing rocks into the water. You can stop now, open your eyes. The exercise was done. He told us to remember our visions, and he said that he was going to ask each of us what we imagined. Mind you, the class was split between girls and boys, so each of us go around one by one and tells the class out loud what we thought about. I remember a boy in my class said that he imagined himself in a rushing waterfall, and there were girls that mentioned that they were swimming in a lake, fishing at the pond, and so on. My turn came, and I told Mr. Smith in our class that I imagined myself next to a small creek. I specifically remember that he has this sort of weird grin the entire time each of us were telling him what was in our minds during this exercise. Mr. Smith finally told us why he had the class do this exercise. He said the exercise was to measure our sexuality and our awakening, I guess you could say. He said that the people who envisioned themselves in large bodies of water had a high drive, while the students who were in calmer and smaller environments of water hadn't really tapped into their sexuality yet. The boy who had the vision of being in a waterfall made a joke and the whole class laughed. I just remember thinking, though, that it was really weird. I looked around at the class and it didn't seem like anyone was uncomfortable, I guess. If they were, they didn't voice it or express it. Mr. Creepy, though, also did this thing where he would pick on a student and ask them a very specific question from our economics textbook. If the student didn't give him an answer that he liked, he would stare them down for literally what felt like a minute without saying anything. You could feel the tension in the class too in these moments, and usually the student with the wrong answer would sink down into their seat with humiliation. Anyway, a few months later, I approached Mr. Smith after class and asked him what I could do for extra credit. I only took away a few things from this conversation. I remember him telling me, "You're incredibly smart. I don't think you need extra credit." Okay, but still, I wanted extra credit. So then he says, "I love your shirt. Where did you get it?" I was wearing a shirt with a unicorn, a yellow yield sign, so I told him that I bought it at a thrift store called Red Light, located in Seattle, where I'm from. He had this stupid grin on his face and asked, "What is it?" And then he said, "You know that Red Light is a explicit site, right? Did you know anything about that?" Upon hearing that, I immediately left. I later looked up the website, I admit, and sure enough, there was all the explicit material that he was referring to. Later on in the semester, Mr. Smith stopped coming to class and we had a substitute for the remainder of the year after that. I remember other students whispering in class where Mr. Smith had gone, and some students were also saying that they had overheard that he got in trouble and was also now being investigated. When I was a Mormon, ages 18 to 28, I went on a mission for the Mormon church like all Mormon men are supposed to do. It was a rite of passage, basically, and it was a full-time sales force for the church. You've probably seen them around, white shirts and ties, usually riding bikes, knocking on doors, trying to get people to believe in angels, giving gold tablets to a farm boy named Joseph Smith. Not much luck if you ask me. It was like trying to sell yellow snow to Eskimos. They just weren't buying it. However, I did have some supernatural experiences, I guess you could say, on my mission. I had such experiences all my life, in fact, and I would like to share some of them with you guys. So, on my mission, I had a dream of a woman and baby being put into a coffin with lots of people crying. I woke up very depressed and sort of sad, and the next day we tracked it into an active member family who recently lost the wife and baby of the son at Ocean Shores, Washington. She was holding the baby in the surf and a wave came up with a log on it, hit her in the head. She died and unfortunately the baby didn't make it before they could rescue him. They were both buried in the same casket and they were the people in the dream. Another time on a mission, we rented a room in a house from a crazy woman who ran a boarding house for men, and a voice called my first name from the closet at night. Mind you, nobody knew my first name, not even my companion. On Mormon missions, missionaries go by Elder so-and-so, and they don't use their first names. But the voice, it kept calling my first name. But how did it know that? I woke up one morning with 3 deep scratches from my groin to my belly, like teen tattoos. They didn't bleed, but man did they burn. The woman had no cat, by the way. A rat could have done it, I suppose, but it would have wakened me up, I think. I never did tell the woman about this, but the next day she said, "Oh, by the way, this house is haunted." Well, we left the very next day. On another occasion in the city of Pacifica, south of San Francisco, we were tracked into an active smoking Mormon. We chatted inside his home near the front door. All he could talk about was how much of a promiscuous woman his daughter was. He heard a knock on the door though, and he opened it, and there stood a massive American Indian about 6'7" or so. The smoking Mormon introduced the Indian as his neighbor Joseph. And when I looked at this Indian, a voice said in my left ear, "He's a murderer." I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. They chatted for a minute and Joseph left. After he left, the smoking Mormon said, "Yep, that was my neighbor Joseph. He's a really swell guy. He's going through a tough time right now. He had to sell his home for bail money. He's been falsely accused of murder." We left pretty soon after that. Also in Pacifica, I lived in a small room with 3 other missionaries. We had bunk beds. One night, when it was raining hard, we stayed in and told some stories. The older elders, they had one story after another of their many sexual conquests in high school. I turned the discussion to ghosts at one point, and as I was talking, a white figure of a young man, about 16 I would say, appeared in the doorway to the tiny kitchen. Just his head and shoulders, and he looked as if he was going to speak, but then got the facial expression of, "What's the use, they can't hear me" sort of thing. The young man faded away and I said, "I see a ghost over by the kitchen." The other elders said, "Shut up, you're just trying to scare us." But my companion said, "No, I saw something too, like a cloud." I could see the young man's face clearly, and the impression I got was that he was a surfer who died in the ocean, perhaps. We lived 100 feet from the ocean, and surfing was illegal there, but many did it anyway, because in the winter the waves were absolutely huge, and there were many great white sharks there as well because of a seal island not far away. Now, the last event on my mission was that I hit a chunk on broken concrete with my 10-speed and went over the handlebars and fell into oncoming traffic. I then felt lifted up by my armpits and pulled back 3 feet. I looked around, but nobody was there, just cars all around me. My companion was already a half a block away, pumping his bike pedals furiously, taking no notice of me. No pedestrians were around anywhere to be seen, and a car ran over my front tire of my bike just as I was being pulled back. Had I not been pulled back 3 feet, the car would have run over my upper body at least, and perhaps my head. That wasn't the first time, nor the last, that unseen hands saved me from death or great bodily injury. But I left my mission disillusioned with missions, mission presidents, and even some missionaries. I thought that it would be an inspiring adventure, but it turned out to be a very boring sort of door-to-door sales job, like trying to sell yellow snow to Eskimos, as I said before. The other missionaries were looking for numbers, I guess, to impress their family and wards, home congregations, and the mission president, the man in charge of the missionaries. I was looking for seekers of truth, though, and was shocked to only find one, a good man who just could not join the church because, well, he smoked. All of our other investigators, people we tried to convert to the church, they were not seekers of the truth, but listened to us because they wanted to marry a good-looking Mormon woman, or because they thought the church could help them out financially, etc. It was all very disappointing, disillusioning, but I did have those paranormal experiences. I eventually resigned from the Mormon church and became the follower of a miracle-working prophet from Lebanon at one point. Those are all days gone by now, but I'll never forget my experiences from when I was a Mormon. I have never truly believed in the supernatural. I thought that it could be possible, I guess, so I stayed the heck away from Ouija boards and the like. But my opinion changed after I had my own personal ghost encounter. I was renting a room in Thailand, and I had been there for a month with no strange occurrences. However, on my second to last day, I woke up and something was off. I felt a distinct presence, I guess. I knew someone was in my room and that he was male. I sat up in bed and I saw a man standing in front of my door. The door was closed behind him. At first I thought it was my next-door neighbor had come into my room, but as I tried looking at him, he had no distinctive features. I'm really not sure how to explain it, but it was like I could only see him with my peripheral vision. Any detail I tried to focus on was fuzzy and unclear. That's when the panic began to set in because I realized I was not seeing a live human. I kept thinking that it would go away if I just kept blinking. So I'm sitting in bed blinking over and over like a maniac, and this thing is just not disappearing. After about 10 seconds of this, I reached for my glass to try and get a clearer look. When I looked back to the door, there was nothing. To be clear, I was scared, but I never felt threatened per se. It was just their sort of thing. I was so convinced I must have had a full-blown hallucination, I just went about my normal day. My host called me later in the day to invite me to the market with her visiting family, and I casually said, "For sure. Also, I think I saw a ghost this morning." She responds, "Did you actually? Come downstairs right now." So I went to her place downstairs, and she was hanging out with her family. This is when she drops the bomb that her house is haunted. She said that she doesn't advertise it, because obviously it would hurt her business, but guests have occasionally seen him over the years. Apparently, both her mother and sister also saw signs of the ghost in the hours before me, a toy car moving by itself, and the sound of a boy laughing in the house. She shared that he is the ghost of a young boy, and that he is allegedly the protector of the house. She showed me his shrine, and it was covered in things that a little boy would enjoy. She said that they were discussing how I was going to be leaving the night before, and she thinks he visited to say goodbye perhaps. She also said that I should buy a small treat to leave at this shrine to say thank you, and I did all that, and flew home the next day. Here's the thing though, I didn't see a boy, I saw a man. I didn't feel a child's presence, I felt the presence of a man. So, was the ghost boy and the sightings by her family just a strange coincidence, and I just straight up hallucinated? It felt so real though. I've never had any sort of hallucinations prior or since that encounter. I've never had sleep paralysis before, and that morning I wasn't paralyzed or anything. This whole experience has shifted my worldview, and sometimes I feel like I'm just going crazy. I'm looking for an explanation, I guess, supernatural or otherwise, for what I witnessed. I've lived here for 10 years now, and there have been things that have happened that have driven me to find answers about it, and even at times beg my husband to leave. I often hear disembodied voices, so compellingly I think someone is in my house, so I go meet them, only to find that there's nobody there. For a while, my front door would open and close by itself. It's a heavy door, made of steel and glass, and there's no way that it could swing open by itself and slam shut. The knob has become a little stuck over the years, and we often have to try multiple ways of opening it now. I even started dowsing to try and find if there were any higher energy fields in my house. I've read so many books to try to explain the sense of anxiety that I get here as well, from fairies to telluric currents. My pendant showed me a path that goes from a hill outside my house, through my house, out the other side and down the creek. After asking it to show me the door that it comes through, I came into my living room from working one day to see the door had been put up in search on my TV, which honestly, I have no idea how that happened. Just yesterday, I noticed a handful of little white pills on my coffee table. I have no idea what they are and how they got there, and neither does my husband. There were probably 10 or so just sort of lined up in a row with no suggestion of how they got there or who put them there in the first place. I've spent 10 years now trying to figure this out, and I haven't even gotten into everything that I've experienced here. If anyone has any ideas or suggestions, I would genuinely love to hear them because, like I said, this whole thing has me absolutely freaked out and I just want to get out of here. A while ago, I was a young and foolish hardcore atheist type who would basically just give it to anyone talking about ghosts or aliens or anything out there, I guess you could say. My worldview was extremely narrow and didn't have much interest in anything outside of going to the pub with my mates. Now, I want to share with you guys the experience which forced me to completely 180 from that old, annoying character into someone who fully believes, no, not believes, but knows the existence of the spiritual world. I was living with my ex-girlfriend, and on her street was a big house on the corner. The property was surrounded by a high fence, but there was a little gate in the middle where you could sort of get a glimpse of the well-kept garden that was there. An old woman who lived alone there and could often be seen pottering around in her garden, who most of her time outdoors would be spent behind the little gate between the fences. We'd see her there all the time, chatting with neighbors or just having a nosy up the street. I never really spoke to her myself, but I did see her there a lot. Now one night at around 10:30, I was pulling up on the street outside of my girlfriend's house after going to see my mate. It was dark, I had literally nothing on my mind, and really wasn't thinking about anything. I parked the car and I proceeded to get out of the door. The house on the corner with the gate was just in front of my parking spot. As I close my car door and I start to lock it, I noticed a bright light coming from that gate. And that was when I look and see a full apparition of this old woman. It was her, but it was like a foggy, translucent figure of her, giving off a pretty big amount of white light. The fence was even illuminated by the light that she was radiating. She turned and looked at me, and as soon as we faced each other, she shifted behind the fence. It wasn't like somebody stepping aside, though. It was like she sort of drifted sideways, as if floating. Being who I was, I instantly tried to dismiss it, convincing myself that I just imagined it. I went into my girlfriend's house and said, "You're going to think that I'm crazy, but I'm sure I just saw a ghost or something at that old woman's house." My girlfriend replied, "You do know she died 2 days ago, don't you?" At that, I froze. Her words were horrifying because they confirmed what I saw. I started freaking out. Kind of funny now that I look back on it all. I remember my eyes were just sort of streaming and I was just sort of in shock, I guess. I kept replaying what I just saw over and over in my mind. It just hit me like a truck. I needed that experience badly, and it changed me and led me on a whole journey of, well, if ghosts are real, what else is there? And I've since discovered a ton about this strange realm that I would have never learned if not for that experience. I really don't care if anyone believes me or not. I wouldn't have believed me either if not for seeing it with my own eyes. We can entertain ghost stories or even choose to believe them, I suppose, but you can't really know them until you've definitely seen it for yourself. I personally have never really shared this, though my wife and girlfriend loves to share this story with anybody who will listen. Years ago, when we first met, my wife and I shared a love of photography and exploration. We called it ghost hunting at the time, but it was more akin to visiting abandoned locations and just taking photographs. I used a 35mm camera with Ilford HP5 Plus film, and she used a Canon Rebel digital camera. We would often scout locations online, with plans to visit them and get some pics for our library. This time it was an old abandoned fuel refinery or storage depot, just off of a beach overlooking Lake Ontario. It would be tricky getting into the old refinery itself from the front, and so I used Google Maps to see if there was any other way that we could get in. It looked like a wall was blocking most of our way in, except for a small section just off of the beach that had only had a chain link fence there. The beach itself looked extremely disheveled, like it had seen little use, so we hoped that this would give us the privacy that we needed to sneak in. I mean, sneaking into an abandoned industrial structure isn't exactly legal, and we didn't want anyone calling the cops on us or whatever. So we packed our gear and we headed out on our excursion. We had a hard time finding the entrance to the beach parking lot, but we found that it was blocked only by a loose chain that lay on the ground, half buried in the dirt as if someone had removed it long ago and just sort of left it there. As we pulled into the parking area, there were no cars except for ours, which we noticed immediately. As we pull in and I park, my wife points out and says, "There's people here." I look up and see several dozen people, all along the shoreline, and all staring out at the water at literally nothing. No ships, no planes, no boats of any kind. They're all just sort of staring blankly. There was nothing particularly interesting about these people. They were all different age groups from young adults to elderly, though there were no children and all were dressed as you'd expect people to dress. What I mean is that it was a warm sunny day, and though some were in shorts, I found it odd that others were in long pants with jackets. It was far too warm for a jacket. What really struck me though was the confusion of how they got there. I mean, there were no cars, no bikes, nothing, and no place to park up on the street for, I would say, at least a few kilometers. No houses nearby either, so no chance of locals. No houses nearby either, so perhaps they were locals? Maybe, but from where? Anyway, they're pretty much ignoring us as we sit in the car, contemplating whether to call the whole thing off, partially because of our need for privacy and partly because of how weird it was feeling. After a few minutes of deliberation, we decided to continue on with the plan though, thinking that whatever they were doing, they're not really interested in us it seems. So we got out of the car, grabbing our cameras, and no sooner do we close and lock our doors when every one of their heads turns to look at us. I mean, every one of them, and there's a couple of dozen of them, still facing the water with their body, but their heads turned to look at our direction. We sort of froze for a second, looked at each other, just completely weirded out. It felt like a long time, but was probably only a minute or so when they all just turned back to face the water, ignoring us again, but all at the exact same time. At this point, we got together and in whispers were discussing what to do. All the while we were watching these people who were now completely ignoring us. Finally though, after some back and forth, we decided to press on in the end. Honestly, we'd been to some far sketchier places in the past, though this was definitely a new one for sure. We walked along the beach to the section of the wall where the fence was and found a gap to enter it. This is when I noticed that they were looking at us again, every single one of them. We paused at this and hesitated to enter. After a few minutes, they again turned away, so trying to be sneaky, we ducked behind the wall to the fence, and from where we were, I couldn't see all of them, but the half dozen or so that I did see, they had again turned their heads toward us, not moving their bodies, just their heads. It just seemed that every time that we moved, that's when they would look at us as well. We were sort of committed at this point though, and so we decided to get in, take our pics, and then quickly get out. Now, the time that we spent in the refinery, it couldn't have been more than 15 minutes. We planned for an hour or more originally, but the strangest being what it was, we knew that this one had to be a short one. As we climbed back through the gap in the fence, the first thing that caught me was that there was nobody in sight. As we climbed back through the gap in the fence, the first thing that caught me was that suddenly there was nobody in sight. I stopped my wife and told her this as we hesitated before passing the wall. We looked out slowly, trying not to call attention to ourselves. As we passed the wall, the entire beach was in view, and there was not a single person there, nobody. Even stranger though was that it looked like nobody had been there at all, at least for a long time. Now, I certainly didn't make any close inspection of the area, but the sand looked undisturbed. There were some footprints, but not enough for several dozen people, and they didn't look new by any means. You know how a beach's sand can look sort of dry on the surface, but if you kick it, darker wet sand underneath shows? Well, there was none of that. Just a few small dunes of dried, blown sand around. It was really, really eerie. The only noise were the distant cars on the road, and after this, we just hurried back to our car. Not running really, but definitely not taking the time to enjoy a day at the beach. Not that there was much to enjoy there anyway. We will never forget that place and how truly freaky all of that was. This story is of some of the first memories that I have. It takes place in a house in Ostel. There's no real order to these as they happened over 30 years ago now. Since these though, I have never had another experience again. To be honest, I sort of wish I had though. So I had a toy record player that was plastic. It played thick plastic records, and one day while I was playing with it, sound just started coming out of the speaker. I don't remember what it was. It didn't last long. I tried to get it to do it again, but nothing. That night, I would hear dishes clank together when everybody was asleep. The way my bed was in my room, I could see down the hallway, and one night, while laying there, I saw a skeleton peek around the corner and wave at me. Another night, I was sleeping on my stomach, and I felt a hand or a claw down my back. Not hard enough to be painful, but definitely enough to wake me up. The next morning, I asked my parents if they had been in my room or not, and both of them said no. These things didn't really scare me, I guess, as I wasn't really old enough to understand what was going on. But the next things, they definitely did scare me and are 100% as I remember them. So I awoke one night to my bed moving, shifting around, levitating even. I heard two male voices talking. I quietly said, "Hey," and one of the voices said, "Shut up, kid." I promptly did just that, and I hid under my covers until I woke up the next day, which is the theme for the next two as well. My mother was sitting on the side of my bed. She was wearing a towel around her body and one around her head while she had just gotten out of the shower. We were praying at the time, and she laid me down to go to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep, and it was at this time that she just sort of faded away. I screamed for her as loud as I could. She came running out of my sister's room into my doorway. Behind her, soldiers in full uniform came running out as well. I hid, and my screaming seemed to have not been heard by anyone, like I was in a bubble at the time. The only one that heard anything was my mother, who came running. The final story is when I went to my parents' room to climb in between them one night, that they were both very much asleep, and after laying there for a few minutes, I hear a voice. "Hey kid." I look at the foot of the bed, and there's this ventriloquist doll, Charlie McCarthy, just sort of, I don't know, like standing there or floating maybe. Mind you, I didn't know that this was him until much later, but he asked me what my name was, what my parents' names were, and after that I got too scared and I hid under the covers. I once wrote the people who lived in this house a while back, asking if they had anything happen to them, and unfortunately I never got a response. But those are my experiences, and to this day I swear by them that they are true. I've decided to share my story because it's something that has stuck with me, and I've never heard a similar experience from anyone else. For context too, I grew up in a very haunted farmhouse. My family saw and heard things as well. So, I was around 10 years old, and I was upstairs playing with a little bouncy ball at some stage. I bounced it, and it went behind a big dresser, so I went over to grab it naturally. Now, there was a smaller dresser next to it that was full of my dad's old comic books, and when I leaned over to grab the ball, a slender white hand came out of the drawer and grabbed onto my wrist. Obviously, I freaked out and tried pulling away. Then the hand gripped tighter, so I started screaming. My brother came running up the stairs, and as soon as he reached the top, the hand let go and disappeared back into the drawer. He didn't see it, unfortunately, but he believed me because of, well, just how shaken up I was. I'm curious, though, if anyone else has experienced anything like this. It's not the only thing that happened to me there, but it was definitely one of the scariest. I still think about it a lot. This happened back in 2017, and I still remember it like it was yesterday. I was in my bedroom laying on my bed. The way the bed is positioned, you can sort of see out into the living room, seeing the TV. My door was open at the time as well, and it was about 1 a.m. Now, the living room television turned on by itself to its loudest volume, and it startled me a lot. I didn't think too much of it because I assumed it was my stepdad, because he enjoys playing pranks on me all the time. So I waited it out until he would come out laughing or do some sort of a jump scare, but in the end he never did. In fact, he came out of his bedroom asking why the TV was on and why it was so loud. Quite honestly, I thought that he was joking, but he was really serious and had a sort of groggy look on his face. So he turns it off and we go back to sleep eventually. The next morning, I ask my dad why the TV went off like that, and he claims that it was the connection to the satellite, and it was nothing to worry about. His explanation, though, it never really sat right with me at all, because First off, that just doesn't make any sense. We don't have a satellite. We had Xfinity at the time. And that television, it didn't have cable, just my dad's room. I asked him again, and this time he tells me in a soft and serious tone, "Don't tell your stepdad that it was a ghost or he's going to freak out and be terrified. Just say that it was the satellite and move on." I did just that as to not cause a commotion, but man, I was absolutely terrified now. Mostly because a few days later, it happened again, this time in my room. I had just turned my TV off after gaming for a few hours, when not even a minute later, my TV turns on by itself, and to make it worse, the TV in the living room turned on too at the same time. That was downright terrifying. I also honestly don't remember what I did after that. Maybe the anxiety is just blocking it all out, but I'll never forget that experience, with the TVs both unexplainably coming on like that simultaneously again. This didn't happen to me, but to my dad. I walked into the kitchen to get a glass of water, and my dad walks into the room, asking me if I'd used the bathroom in my parents' bedroom. I tell him no, and that I've been in my room the whole time. I could tell, though, that something was wrong when I saw the look of fear on his face. He told me that somebody was in the bathroom, and it wasn't my mum or my brother because they're asleep apparently. I asked him what he was talking about. He told me that he was going to use the bathroom but heard loud noises, so he stood by the door, which was open, but didn't walk in because he didn't understand what was going on. He said that he thought that for whatever reason someone was using the toilet with the door open, so he continued to wait by the door sort of confused. But then he said that he realized that it sounded like something different, and that it was too loud to be someone using the toilet, and that it sounded like someone was vomiting into the toilet because he heard splashing. Then he said that he heard the sound of a man gagging and clearing his throat, so he gets concerned and peeks into the bathroom, but nothing. The noises were gone and nobody was there. He said that he knew what he heard was real and that it was so real that he had to check behind the bathroom door just to make sure that no one had broke in. And then he checked the shower and he said that his jaw dropped because he saw soapy water and dirt all over the floor of the shower. He then says that he doesn't know how to explain what happened, and to be honest, neither do I. If anyone knows what this is about or has any other logical explanations, then I would genuinely love to hear it. I'm really not quite sure how to start this, so I'm just going to say it. I have some sort of an entity in my house that is getting more and more active, and I really don't know how to get it to stop. The lights in my bathroom flicker, even when I screw them in more. Lights in my bedroom have turned on and off by themselves, at the switch, mind you. I often see something in my peripheral. Whenever I look at it, it disappears, but it seems like it's wearing some kind of black robe, and I feel or hear 3 gentle taps on my temple every now and then, usually when I'm trying to fall asleep. It's unsettling having this much activity lately, since the activity had previously declined. A little bit of background. I live at home with my family. I'm in my childhood bedroom in the basement. When I was a teenager, I was really stupid, and at one point, 2018 if I had to guess, me and my friends held a seance with a Ouija board in my room. We had contact with something that called itself Jason. It told us things that we knew were lies, like that it died in this house, no previous owners mind you, and stuff like that. We said goodbye and thought that that was the end of it, kept the Ouija board in the hall closet. After that, there would be random cold spots in my room though. Like, you would be sweating from the space heater until you sat on the bed and it would be super cold. There was also a really uneasy feeling in the hall, where the closet was. Then at some point, maybe 2021 I think, I started seeing this thing. It was like it used to be a woman, but there was black instead of a mouth and eyes, and it was smiling literally from ear to ear. I would always pretend that I didn't see it, walk past and go about my business. I eventually told my friends in 2023 about that creepy thing and explained how it was next to the Ouija board. We eventually made a plan to bury the board. I took the board to her place, she gave me some sage, and I tried to light it over the Ouija board, but the spring in the lighter shot straight out, leaving the lighter completely useless. I did get another lighter and lit it away from the board and cleansed the board. Then we talked about where to bury it. It was around this point that we saw a very young kid standing in the street just sort of staring at us. We went to see where his parents were, but as soon as we walked his way, he just ran. We watched him go into a house that my friend thought was abandoned, and my friend swears that he was a demon, but I think that she was just being paranoid. In any case, we left the board on the sidewalk to go and get some lunch because we were really stupid, and when we came back, you guessed it, it was gone. I figured